reading for this Sunday, the second Sunday after Epiphany, is from Matthew 4, although I will be referencing this same story in Mark and Luke, but the reading itself that we're going to focus on here is from Matthew 4, verses 1 through 17. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to him, "All these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. Now, when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, and so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled, land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and for those who sat in the region and the shadow of death, light has dawned. From that time, Jesus began to proclaim, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." So, I think the temptation of Jesus is probably a familiar reading to most people. It shows up in Matthew, it shows up sort of similarly in Luke, and it shows up a little more briefly in Mark. And it's fun. I think it's fun. Maybe not everyone will agree. I think it's fun because they all treat it a little differently, because all four of the Gospels have a slightly different take on not who Jesus is maybe in the grand sense, but in sort of like the image, the public image they want to give to him. So they focus on things slightly differently. So in John, for instance, there's no temptation narrative at all, because the emphasis is entirely on the identity of Jesus as divine and his teaching and enactment in the world. For Luke, who mirrors a lot of Matthew. For Luke, Jesus' identity is primarily as a prophet, someone who's there to break apart the systems as they are, to challenge things, to make something new, to focus on justice and healing and restoration. For Mark, we instead get Jesus as this secret Messiah, this suffering servant. In Mark, everything is terrible. Mark is where we get Jesus' last words as, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Mark is where the disciples are all kind of idiots, and Jesus is constantly criticizing them. For Mark, it's the suffering servant imagery a lot that we talked about in Isaiah. For Matthew, the image that he wants to create is Jesus as a prophet like Moses and lawgiver. And so Matthew, more than any of the others, focuses on imagery from Exodus and Deuteronomy and drags up a lot of Old Testament material to try and put Jesus in line with this larger tradition, which is what we have here. And so you get fun things like, between Luke and Matthew, the order of the temptations changes. They both start with bread, but in Luke, the next one is offering the nations, and the final one is from the temple, because Jesus as a prophet is primarily there to challenge the institutions of religion that are there and overthrow the hypocrisy therein. In Matthew, who is trying to cast Jesus more like Moses, this sort of authority figure lawgiver, you get the bread and then the temple and then offering the nations, because this sort of rule over the land that Moses sort of institutes these rules are where he wants to focus. I think that makes it sort of interesting. Jesus is in the desert for 40 days in all of them, as a throwback to the 40 years of wandering in the desert in Exodus. And so for Matthew, first we get bread, right? Jesus has been out there a long time, and he's hungry. It's not that there's nothing in the wilderness. The word wilderness and desert, by the way, are the same word in Greek. And it isn't a like sand dunes, Sahara deserty kind of place. It's the rocky, craggy, you can't grow stuff there kind of place. So there's streams, there's little things available, but he hasn't eaten. And the first temptation is, okay, so make bread. Which seems sort of reasonable. And my initial thought every time I read this is, why is this a problem? Clearly Jesus thinks that it is wrong for him to turn a stone into bread, but he never really explains why, does he? Like, man does not live on bread alone. Sure, but we also do live on bread. Like, that's part of being the human part. So he never really explains. But make into bread. No. Okay. So then we go to the second one. Take a dive off the temple. Probably sort of a reference to Mount Sinai, right? Moses at the height of the mountain getting the laws and coming down to give them to the people. And admittedly, jumping off the temple and being caught before he hit the ground, that would be a neat show, right? Everyone there would know this guy was special, but I don't know, like base dive, it's like skydiving, you know. What is the temptation here exactly? Just to show off? So Jesus is like, no, I'm not going to tempt fate. And then he brings him up to this tall mountain, nondescript, somewhere very high where you can see all the kingdoms in the territory, which once again is a throwback to Moses and the Israelites coming into Canaan and conquering all of the kingdoms of the Canaanites, right? And having the land for themselves under their rule. But this one isn't proof. The other two are proof, right? If you're the Son of God, do this, so we know. The angels will catch you. You can turn stones into bread. This one's a deal. This one's not just proof of who you are. This is a contract. Like, worship me, and you can have all of this. It's not clear how he can offer this. Luke words it a little differently and makes it more clear. Presumably, God's already the king of it all anyways, so you're kind of offering him what's already his. But regardless, he says no. Worship only God. But it's interesting that this one, instead of the other two, is a deal. So, we have to ask a couple of questions when assessing these. And I you all know I like to push the envelope, so I'm going to push it a little bit here. Question number one, when we're looking at these, because I don't know, they feel strange to me, right? Why is bread so wrong? Why would you want to jump off? Like, what's the point? Can Jesus do these things? And our gut instinct is probably to say yes, because there's all kinds of miraculous things that Jesus does. But there are, in the Gospels, remember, he goes back to Nazareth at one point, and in Matthew it says he doesn't do any miracles. But in Mark it specifically says he can't do miracles in Nazareth because of people's unbelief. If he's out in the middle of nowhere, no one around, can he do these things? The Gospels seem to indicate there are limits of some kind to what he can do. So it's an interesting question of, is he being tempted to do things that he can do to prove who he is? Or is this somehow a temptation to kind of show his hand and say he can't do all these things? Just an observation. Second, the why in the first place. Why in the world does Jesus need to go out and go through these 40 days and temptations? There's no, he doesn't fill out a travel plan at the beginning and hey, everybody, I'm going to go do this because I have to for this reason, and when I come back, I'll do this, right? There's no explanation for why this has to happen, at least not in Mark, not in Luke, not in Matthew, not in Luke, and not in John, because it doesn't happen in John. But Mark gives a reason that I think makes sense, although it's really terrifying if everybody raised to be terrified. This is right after Jesus' baptism. And at the end of Jesus' baptism, right, the dove comes down, there's the light from heaven and the voice, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." And then he goes off into the desert. In Mark, we still translate it in English. In every English translation you will ever find, it says, "I am well pleased." But in Mark, the verb is not am pleased, it's was pleased. It's in a tense called aorist, which is a simple past tense that Greek uses. The others use perfect tense. This perfect tense is used for this book is written, right? It was written at a specific time, it was printed, and it's still written, right? It's still a thing. Aorist is, I ran to the store yesterday. I'm not still running to the store, right? It is no longer the case. It is a specific event. In Mark, for whatever reason, in all of the old manuscripts, they use aorist. "This is my son in whom I was well pleased." And the next line, it says that the Spirit, and here the Spirit leads him out, but in Mark it says the Spirit, ekvalo is the Greek word. It's the same word that's used for casting out demons. It means driven away. Jesus is driven into the desert by the Spirit. That's the Mark version. Matthew, like Luke, likes to clean up Mark. Matthew and Luke both take Mark as a base, and then they add on stuff, and they both change the word from aorist to perfect, so he is still well pleased, and they both change it from driven out to led out or guided out. But I think Mark makes way more sense. I don't know why the Father's mad when Jesus gets baptized per se. I don't pretend to understand the family dynamics there per se. But if he is driven into the desert for 40 days and undergoes suffering and temptation as a weird kind of penance of sorts, that makes more sense, although it doesn't fit with much else, does it? I don't know. This is why I love the Bible. It's such a mess. It is a beautiful, holy mess. And I love that about it so much, because I can give you a whole lot more questions than answers. And I think that's perfect. All right, so now that I have wrecked everything, what are the takeaways? What's the point? Why am I going through all of this just to confuse and bother people? Other than because I think it's fun. One, because it is a messy document. When you're reading this, and I hope you do at least on occasion, pick up one of these or listen to it. There's lots of great audio Bibles and stuff. It's messy. It is not a single perspective. It is a lot of different people who experience the divine trying to come to terms with what that means for them and for others. That is what Jesus calls it. It is testimony is the word Jesus uses for scriptures. Testimony. And just like other human testimony, that means that it comes with all of the problems of human testimony, of people's memory and people's perceptions and things like that, which is why we have 4 Gospels and not 1, and the bishop that tried to smush them all together into one was run out of town back in the 200s. Because it's messy and it's supposed to be. And that's frustrating, but that's the reason we can do this. That's the reason we get together and talk about it and work through it. If it wasn't messy, there wouldn't be any need for this. 2, you can make the Bible say whatever you want, and the devil proves that, right? The devil here quotes Scripture to Jesus, trying to get him to do things that at least Jesus thinks he shouldn't do. Which means you can take things in here, and we have all seen this. This is not a surprise to anyone. You can use and abuse so many lines out of here for your own ends, and people often do. And this is part of why I complain sometimes about the cuttings, right? I constantly am changing where I start and stop the readings for any given Sunday because they leave out the next line that helps make sense out of all of this other stuff. Because if you cut out individual lines, you can make this say just about anything. The point of it, the arc of the narrative, the story, the purpose isn't caught up in tiny little fragments. It's in the story. It's in the whole thing put together. Makes it a little more tricky, but it is dangerous to cherry pick individual lines, because the devil can do that too. And third, what are we supposed to take from this story specifically? Now, I've given you lots of options of things to confuse you. I want to give. There are all kinds of versions of sermons on this. I have heard so many different versions of sermons on the temptation of Jesus. Is this about denying, a power over nature and spiritual power and political power to make the church, to give the church an example of living out life in a way that isn't tyrannical in some sense, or that doesn't try and make God into some kind of monster pulling the strings on everything? There's versions of that. Here's my takeaway. The sort of some purpose for this narrative. We are really frequently, in my experience, I shouldn't make this universal. In my experience, people largely talk about temptation as being something faced in the context of others, right? Peer pressure things and stuff like that. That temptation is more often than not because of others around us. But Jesus seems to face temptation, or the image that we're given here of temptation is not when he's surrounded by people trying to get him to do something. It's when he's off by himself with no one else around to remind him of who he is and what's important. The bread becomes a temptation, I think, not because using some limited resource, I don't even know. The bread becomes a temptation because he does it on his own, rather than relying on somebody to plant that wheat and harvest it and grind it up into flour and cook it into bread and get it to him, right? Rather than relying on this community of people to make something possible, just does it for himself. At the temple, there's no earning trust with those around or exercising some kind of reason. He throws himself off the temple and the angels catch him, and man, I bet everybody there would be real impressed and let him do things without the support, the guidance, the context of that community. Brings him up onto this mountain over everybody else, says, hey, it's all yours, you rule. You rule it all. No relying on anyone else to get there, no relying on these communities, no grassroots movement, no building community. You just get it, and you have the power to do whatever you want, and no one can stop you. I think the temptations, all of them, are about independent power versus community. All of them. Because the real threat in all of these is not whatever. Who cares? Jesus does all kinds of miracles. Who cares if he turns a rock into bread? Well, because it cuts out the community. He already is king of the world. Who cares if he starts right away, right? Well, because it cuts out the process of getting there by building the community. The real threat here is this sense of independence that says, I don't need anybody else. And maybe I see that in the text most because I'm that guy that wants to do everything on my own and not rely on people. But that's not how life works. That's not how it's supposed to work. We've talked about this again and again. That the vision God has for the world in here is one where we are interconnected and leaning on each other at all times for support. The first day I came here, I preached about the Christ hymn and talked about how the impressive thing that Jesus does according to the Christ hymn is redefine godhood from being the ability to do anything without consequence to being the one who loves themselves to death in support of everyone. And I don't think that message is isolated to the Christ hymn. I like the Christ hymn, and I like starting with the Christ hymn because I think that's the lesson in a lot of this. That it is about transforming this image of who we are supposed to be, about what the perfect vision of ourselves and God is, from being the ability to do what we want to being the need and ability to care for one another. And so the temptation of the wilderness is in being alone, and is to be able to be alone. And so the story of the temptation ends, in all cases, with Jesus beginning his ministry, calling his disciples, and starting the process of building a community to work together to transform the world. That's the story. Amen.